Let's go now to the war in Israel. Why does the West continually capitulate to Hamas? We talked earlier about the Teals calling for refunding of UNRWA. We've seen calls for Israel to be measured in its response. Penny Wong, all this, moral equivalence stuff. Calls for ceasefires endlessly. The left's ridiculous pro-Palestinian posturing. It seems the West is determined to hand victory to Hamas. So, joining us to discuss the absurdity of all this and much more is our dear friend Richard Kemp, former British military commander. He's taught the IDF much of what they know, so he's the man to tell outsiders what is going on. Is the West, Richard, handing victory to Hamas?
Well, I never disagree with you, Rowan, but on this occasion I'll say I haven't taught the IDF much of what they know. They don't need me as a teacher, although I do everything I can to possibly be of assistance. But the situation now is that the United States, which is obviously the most important player outside Israel in this particular conflict, and other Israeli allies like the UK and Australia as well, they're pressing Israel for what's called a humanitarian pause or ceasefire to try and get release of the hostages, which is probably a good thing as long as Hamas can be forced to comply with whatever terms are agreed, as long as it doesn't lead to a long-term cessation of hostilities. And that, I think, is what President Biden wants. He wants this war to end and end now, before Israel's achieved its objectives. He wants to end the war, and he wants to hand a reward to Hamas and to their supporters in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, to hand them a kind of basically a prize for their assault on Israel on the 7th of October by making a Palestinian state. That's the words that Biden's been using. And his priority here seems to me to be not to allow his ally to secure victory over a ruthless genocidal terrorist mob. He wants to have a foreign policy victory himself in advance of the elections in November, and that he sees as being ending the war on Hamas's terms and creating a Palestinian so-called state. And of course, he needs a foreign policy victory desperately because he's failed in pretty much every other of his foreign policies, like yes. in Afghanistan, in Ukraine. Ukraine is going to the dogs largely because of a lack of American support. So he needs something else that he recognizes. He sees that potentially as being a defeat for Israel.
James.
But under the doctrines of Islamic warfighting, a Hudna treaty is what's called. If Hamas is allowed to remain in power at all, they will simply use that treaty as a chance to rearm, won't they? And as long as the Biden administration is supporting the renormalization of the mullahs in Iran and empowering them and freeing up their bank accounts and letting them sell oil and everything like that, we are only going to wind up seeing this happen again and again and again, won't we?
Yeah, absolutely right. And there is no, in my view, there is no justification whatsoever of anything other than the complete defeat of Hamas in Gaza. It must happen, and Israel must be supported by its allies to bring that about. And it's not just the West that should be wanting that. It's also Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries like Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, whatever they might say in public, they really want Israel to smash Hamas. Hamas is a threat to their countries. Its jihadist doctrine is a threat to their countries. They want to see a strong Israel. And you can apply, as you said, you brought Iran in. Iran's hands is behind so much of this. Iran is being appeased. There's US still pushing, maybe not quite so strongly now, for some kind of a deal with Iran. And of course, its major proxy up in Lebanon, Hezbollah, which also there's pressure towards some kind of a treaty or agreement with Hezbollah to move north up to the Litani River or towards the Litani River. All of that is, as you rightly said in the start of your point, is that none of these treaties, none of these agreements can possibly be considered to be agreements that will be honoured by any of these organizations. They will do exactly as they like. They will say one thing, they'll do another. They will only act in their own interest, or what they perceive to be their own interest. They will not honour any agreement or treaty.
Rita.
And there's reports that Iran's given the green light for Hezbollah to launch large-scale attacks on Israel. But I want to ask you about the anti-Semitism we're seeing, particularly in the UK. Jews say they don't feel safe going out in London on weekends where there are these mass rallies. And we've now got a former Attorney General, Sir Michael Ellis, saying that the BBC is adding to that climate. He says the BBC is institutionally anti-Semitic, and its reporting on the Hamas war has led to some of this ill feeling and hostility and sometimes attacks against British Jews. Is that a fair assessment?
I think it's a very fair assessment. And, the BBC is notoriously biased against Israel and has been for many, many years now. All of their reporting on Israel is very heavily slanted. And in fact, in 2021, the Simon Wiesenthal Center in the United States, which predominantly deals with Holocaust-related issues and anti-Semitism, they publish an annual list of the most anti-Semitic organizations in the world. And in 2021, the BBC came in number 3 on their list of anti-Semitic organizations, just behind. Number 1 was Iran, number 2 was Hamas, number 3 was the BBC. So this is not something that's. It's not, I'm not jesting, and this is. You can find all this online, and it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. And I think what's not clear is whether or not the staff of the BBC actually believe what they pump out in their anti-Israel propaganda, or whether they just want to do it to suit their own agendas. And of course, their agenda is not just anti-Israel; it's anti the West, it's anti-British values, and it's very much in favour of the extreme left, where there is, of course, an intersectionality with anti-Israelism. But it's not just the BBC. There are many other media organisations in the UK, particularly broadcast media, which are also heavily slanted against Israel, and indeed against the West. And they do have, in my view, blood on their hands, because, and it's not just them either, it's not just media, it's the organisations like the UN, it's international organisations like the EU, it's so-called human rights organisations, which play into Hamas's hands. Hamas want Israel to be condemned for killing Gazan civilians, and therefore Hamas constructs their military operations in a way that will maximise the number of deaths among their own civilian populations. Israel tries very hard and succeeds in reducing civilian deaths, but of course, inevitably in the situation, the way that Hamas fights, some are inevitable, and a large number have happened, unfortunately. And when people condemn Israel for fighting within the laws of armed conflict and for inadvertently incurring civilian deaths, they play right into Hamas's hands and encourage them more and more. And that, of course, translates into the kind of anti-Semitic hatred on the streets of Britain, Australia, the United States and other countries. And
just very quickly, Richard, before we go, how much is Islamist ideology crippling, I would argue, British democracy? We saw the scenes in the Commons last week. We've seen this George Galloway character elected on the weekend, some pretty vile attitudes that he's been accused of in the past. And we had poor old Suella Braverman, who pointed out that Islamist activists were thwarting British democracy, and she got punted. So how much is there a real risk that now, the way the demographics are going, that British democracy is under threat from extreme Islamism?
I think it's been under threat from extreme Islamism for many years. It was under threat from this same ideology when I was working in the British Cabinet Office back in 2022 and beyond that. And it's, we're seeing politics. The current situation, which is maybe beginning to be recognised because it's been intensified by the Gaza conflict, forced the Prime Minister out onto the streets in front of number 10 Downing Street last night to deliver a message of concern about it. But it's not enough. He may be concerned, he was not specific about what he's going to do about it. He recognised that Jews in Britain are under threat. He recognised that British democracy is under threat from Islamist activism. But he didn't specify how he's going to deal with it. And my view is he will not deal with it. Hand-wringing is one thing, action is another thing. And I'm not really expecting, unfortunately, any action from Rishi Sunak. I'm expecting the situation to deteriorate until Labour gets into power, when it will get much, much worse.
Well, on that cheerful note, Richard Kemp, thanks so much for chatting to us. We'll be chatting a lot more over the coming months. Let's get Suella Braverman into Downing Street. If you could organise that before the next show, we'd greatly appreciate that. Richard Kemp, thank you so much.